Alrighty then. Thank you so much. I was sort of pausing to wait for our new president, Michaela Wheaton, and maybe she'll be along shortly. But I know that everybody has busy lives, so we like to try to start things close to on time. So I'm giving you the big thumbs up, and now we're going to start. Good evening. My name is Jeff Tim, and I hold the fortunate position of chairman of the religion department. On behalf of my colleagues, Barbara Darling and Jonathan Brumberg-Kraus, I welcome you all this evening to our 32nd annual Martin Lecture in Religion. First, I want to give a special welcome to the new president of Wheaton College, Michaela Wheaton. You can tell her when she comes that I welcome her. And second, I would like to just take a moment to recognize our Fulbright Scholar in Residence, Dr. Wang Chuk Rinzan, who's right here in the front. In addition to his teaching and research duties, Wang Chuk leads a weekly Vajrayāna Buddhist meditation practice on Wednesdays from 5 to 6 p.m. in the chapel basement, and directs us in some of the very practices that tonight's lecturer will be making sense of. And third, I'd like to express my gratitude to the family of Dr. J. Arthur Martin for their ongoing support. J. Arthur Martin, he lived from 1912 to 1980. And Dr. Martin was a professor of religion, and he was the longtime chairman of the religion department from 1949 to his retirement in 1978. Professor of religion, longtime chairman of the department, Professor Martin also served as the college chaplain from 1949 to 1957. It was Professor Martin who introduced the first course on world religions taught at Wheaton College, a tradition of inquiry that we carry on to the present. And a tradition of inquiry that has shaped our speaker this evening. Michael Sheehy is a scholar of Tibetan Buddhism who studies contemplative practices. His writing, translation, and research give attention to the contemplative and philosophical thought in Tibet, and more broadly, to the relevance of meditation research to the interdisciplinary humanities. Michael's research focuses on the generative, dynamic, and ever-evolving processes of contemplative practices, detailed in Vajrayāna Yoga and meditation manuals. Michael is a research assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. He's a series editor for the Contemplative Sciences, as well as the Traditions and Transformations in Tibetan Buddhism book series at the University of Virginia Press. Michael has also presented me with a copy of his first book, a co-edited volume titled The Other Emptiness, Rethinking Zentong Buddhist Discourse in Tibet. I know it's the first of many. Michael's list of accomplishments are already many pages long, but the most wonderful fact about Michael's background, in my humble opinion, is that he graduated from Wheaton College with a major in Asian Studies in 1998, writing the longest honors thesis in my memory. Over 184 pages, titled, quote, Teardrops of the Lotus, the contemporary condition of human rights in Tibet and the Buddhist path of healing social conflict. What a wonderful study. But what's super amazing and remarkable to me is that now, 24 years later, Michael is tilling the same fields with an ever deepening skillfulness, wisdom, and compassion. Yeah. Don't look at that, look at me. Almost a quarter century ago, 24 years ago, Michael had added a handwritten dedication to that long thesis that he presented to me. It works just as well today as it did then. So I'll quote it in closing. May the empty bliss jewels within sprout into full lotuses for the benefit of all. Peace be with you. Please join me in welcoming Wheaton's own Dr. Michael Sheehy.
Hello. Thank you all for coming out this evening. I appreciate it. It's wonderful to see so many of you and so many faculty members, so many of the students especially, and having met many of you in class today and at dinner just before, it's really wonderful. And I see so much in myself in your experiences and being back on campus. And it's really, it's been delightful. It's been a delightful day so far. So first I'd like to thank and extend my gratitude to all of those who made this Martin Lecture on Religion possible. I'd like to thank the organizers, all of you behind the scenes, you know, Professor Brumberg-Kraus, and so wonderful to see you, Barbara, Professor Darling. It's a real honor to be with you all this evening. For those of you who don't know, and as Jeff just mentioned, actually, I was a student here 24 years ago. And to be back in this capacity is very meaningful to me. During a lifetime, there's only a few persons who might, if you're fortunate, influence your trajectory. Their parents, their friends, their peers, and their teachers, who bracket their own preoccupations long enough to acknowledge your yearnings and passions, to peer into your world, and to find ways to encourage those yearnings and passions in constructive ways. For me, Professor Tim was one of those persons. And for that, I'm deeply grateful, Jeff. Thank you. So today, I'd like to take this opportunity to think aloud with all of you about reconsidering the importance of meditation, specifically the broad range of Buddhist Vajrayāna practices from the Tibetan and Himalayan cultural world. And when I say that, I'm focused on Tibet, the Tibetan cultural sphere, but it's broader than that. In the Himalayan world, Bhutan, where Professor Wangchuk's from, and across the Indian Himalaya, Nepal, Ladakh, and then north into inner and outer Mongolia, these traditions have historically spread with their origins in India, in South Asia. So as a consequence, what it might mean to take these practices seriously as an object of academic inquiry. Humans are embodied and encultured beings. We enact our lives and relationships to an environment in which we are embedded and into which our minds and our bodies extend. Cognition is thereby an extension of the body in the world, in the worlds in which we live. Are social, cultural, and natural. Lived worlds are layered with contextual complexity, contexts that are temporal and spatial and philosophical and metaphysical and cosmological. And these layers, these contexts, I think we need to honor when we talk about contemplation. And in turn, these contexts inform who we are, how we move and behave in the world. Meditation practices are also embedded in myriad contexts that inform the content and the styles of practices across time and space. And tonight I'm going to be going through some of these styles with you. The set and settings of the practice, the relational agents in which we practice with and for, The view is, however, a radical departure. This view that I'm laying out is a radical departure from the modern popular presentations that reduce mindfulness, meditation in particular, to a panacea for an individual. The idea that you can train your brain and everything will be all right. The idea that you are your brain is the sort of neurocentricity that has emerged in current discourse around meditation. If we are to understand, or if we do not understand meditation practices to be cultural practices, to be deeply embedded and embodied practices, but instead reduce and extract these practices from their meaning-imbued context in which they are embedded, I'll argue we're participating in an appropriation of practices that leads to all kinds of misunderstandings and conflations, which we see again in this contemporary mindfulness movement. So partly what I'm trying to do tonight is sort of present a different view, a different way of thinking about contemplation and meditation practices. But more importantly, perhaps, is that these practices will not retain their full potency unless these contexts are honored. All right, so that's a little bit of a background of what I want to talk about. And as way of homage, back to sort of narrative here, is this was graduation day in 1998 with Jeff. A little bit of my own story. So I completed my graduate work a few years after, or I went to graduate school a few years after I graduated Wheaton. I went to India for a few years in between. And then I went to Tibet and I studied in Tibet, in Eastern Tibet. This is actually in 2004, my first, I had been in Tibet in 1999, but in 2004 I went to live and study there in earnest, and in particular focus on texts. And much of my work is as a textualist, but also grounded in what we might call field work, but also within the living traditions, within these practice traditions. So this is an overview of what I'd like to go over tonight. What is the importance of meditation? Why it's like the why should we care slide, right? The paradigms, what are we talking about? And I'll lay that out a little bit. Contemplative styles, I'm going to flip through in a rather rapid fashion what I call contemplative styles, the myriad ways that meditation plays itself out, that I've been articulating in kind of taxonomy. Practices, we're then going to turn to sort of case studies, and I'm going to talk about darkness practices of dark retreat. I'm going to talk about dream practices, what is called dream yoga. I'm going to talk about some practices to induce ecstatic states. And then we'll conclude with some ideas about possible futures and where the academic study of meditation can go. So I think all lectures should begin with the who cares slide. So this is my why should I care slide. Why study meditation? Right? Why should we pay attention to contemplative studies or the study of meditation as an academic inquiry? And I'll argue it's because practices are integral to being human. They're integral to human knowledge. They're integral to human heritage. Not only do we inherit these practices and the traditions from the living traditions of these that these practices are transmitted through, but these practices also can be acquired, right? So there's these two ways that our human heritage holds these practices. Secondarily, the nature of consciousness is one of really the great riddles of our time. You know, Einstein's sense of not sense, but rather equations for gravity, moved us forward in light years of physics, and what quantum physics has done is really broken out new ways of looking at the world. Things like time remain a riddle, but consciousness, it remains one of the greatest riddles today to humans. And these practices provide methods to experimentally probe our subjectivity. They provide a methodology to look inward, to look at our minds and our inner worlds. And the insights into the primacy of subjectivity operationalize human flourishing. That is to say, these practices aren't just for the sake of looking at ourselves, but in so doing, they have byproducts. There are outcomes that are oriented towards human flourishing. that these practices are also, particularly the ones I'm being presented tonight, they're in danger. They present an endangered knowledge set, an endangered practice. Okay, and I think it's important to think about these as a kind of species of knowledge that's in danger because of social, cultural, historical forces. So, what do I mean when I say meditation? What are some of the paradigms, the parameters, the models, frameworks? And so this is how I'm thinking about these practices. They are distinctive forms of human performance. Okay? They are, I want us to think about this as performance, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit and use analogies in language from sports, from music. These are things we perform, okay? But they're distinctive. They're not like other ways of human performance. And how so? Well, first of all, they're multiple and diverse, right? There's an astonishing variety of these practices. There's mindfulness has become synonymous with meditation, and many people, when you say meditation, they think mindfulness. That's a very, very narrow sense of what I'm talking about. These are extraordinarily diverse, and they, in fact, define, at least within the traditions that I'm familiar with, any normative or singular definition. That these practices, derive an aesthetic experience derives from these practices. These are aesthetically oriented practices, okay? That is to say, beauty or awe emerge from practice. That I'm talking about formal practices. I'm not talking about something you do while you're washing your dishes or walking your dog or stuck in traffic. Those are great too, but let's bracket those as informal practices. Tonight I'm talking about formal practices, right? There are boundaries of time and place. There's a set and setting. There are what I'll call incubatory worlds, that is to say zones, if you will, that you go into. And again, to borrow a sports analogy, NBA players say, when they step on the court, they're in the zone, they're locked in, okay? They're in that incubatory world. And when they step off, they're out. So there are boundaries, demarcations that are important in these practices. And there are postures of the body, the voice, and the mind that are performed within these boundaries. But these are procedural. That is to say, there's very specific ways and techniques to go about these practices. They're not just sort of, ad hoc practices. They can be tightly scripted, or they can involve considerable indeterminacy. That they're intentional, that you have a mindset when you come. You intend and orient yourself in certain directions, towards certain aims, whether it be sociological or pragmatic for health reasons and so forth. That these are attentional practices. They require your undivided attention. They're not something that you do when you're on your smartphone and you're multitasking. No, these require undivided attention. This is very important. And that there's a kind of art and science experience that you're constantly monitoring. You're constantly looking at where are my challenges, where am I excelling, and making modifications, adjustments according to signs that emerge, going for feedback with those who have experience, with those who are teachers and peers. Okay? Another way to think about these practices is that they're disruptive technologies. They're designed to disrupt ordinary ways of being in the world, ordinary habitual patterns of awareness, of bodily sensibility, of perception. They're meant to disrupt these. And as I opened with my opening remarks, which I really feel is important, these are cultural practices. These come out of socio-cultural worlds that cannot be extracted and taught in the vacuum or practiced in the vacuum. This is a very important point. Even if you are alone in a cave in the Himalayas, you are informed by your social cultural world, okay? And the practices are an expression of that. And that they're generative, that these practices can be made anew once you understand them. There's some fantastic research on the origins of the human species, the Homo sapiens, and how we survived by making tools. And one of the distinctive features of Homo sapiens is that we were able to look not just at tools as mechanisms, but we were able to create new tools by looking at them in a modular fashion. Taking this part of the tool and putting it with that tool to make a new tool. Taking this and that in a plug-and-play model to complexify tool making. So these are technologies in the same way that tools are in order to generate new outcomes, in order to generate new experiences, let's say. And I think to think about these as generative is important, and the analogy that my colleague at the University of Virginia Contemplative Sciences Center, David Germano, and I are using is that these are like language. There's a kind of proficiency that you can learn, like you would acquire a new language, right? Like you learn Japanese or French or Arabic, that you can learn it, but you need to learn the fundamentals, and that leads itself to kind of contemplative fluency. So they're generative. Okay? Now, there are inherent tensions in this tradition, which I want to point out as kind of background. This is like, the background noise of these contemplative traditions. One is that there's this tension between being progressive, that they progress along in a gradual way, or that they're instantaneous, that they emerge, that experiences emerge by practicing them on their own. And in parallel, this other tension is what they call effortful or effortless. That you're putting in a lot of effort, or you're releasing effort, right? So another way to think about this, which I'll unpack in a second, is that they're habitual, they're oriented towards habit and habit acquisition and skill acquisition, or habitless, which is an interesting idea. I'd like you all to think about for a moment. What does it mean to be habitless? And what kind of ways would that suggest of being in the world? Okay, so there's this Tibetan term gong, means habituation or familiarization. It's the most common word for meditation. I guess translated into English, meditation. This word gong, and it means to cultivate, to become familiar with, to deepen in a kind of deeply habituated way, right? And this denotes practices that involve a deep conditioning to the extent of yielding automaticity, right? Which through initial effort eventually saves energy and neurophysiological resources, which in turn makes the process of coordinating learned automatism easier, right? You put in the effort, but then once you do, it becomes easier, right? It's like the first time you swim a lap, it's hard. The 100th time you swim a lap, you're like, okay, I understand the stroke a little bit better. I'm a little more fluid, right? In the same way with these practice, this model of practices, okay? But the pitfall of this approach, and again, this is just one kind of approach I'm laying out, is that these are automated reflexes become a kind of rigid automaticity, right? You're replacing habits with new habits, and then those new habits become rigid, right? So this creates a kind of new fixed habitual patterns of responsiveness. And this approach likens meditation to skill acquisition, right? Like a craft, like an art, like learning how to paint, like learning how to play the violin or the piano or shoot a free throw, okay? The practitioner applies the attentive effort required to become a master artist. For instance, this is a quote from a text I recently translated by Jigme Lingpa, who's a 18th century Tibetan author and commentator. He writes in reference to this approach, this is like when learning arts, such as writing, painting, carving, and so forth. At first, there's no other way than to apply metrics, right? You have metrics, and you meet those metrics and you move forward. It's a very measured approach. Like this, art is produced gradually through a very careful process. Okay, so this is meditation like skill acquisition. Okay, there's another approach, however, within the Tibetan tradition, and this is the other side of the tension. What are called spontaneous practices that lend themselves to self-emergence, right? All kinds of experiences emerge on their own. A style of meditation in which conditions are set to foster automated emergence and appreciation of contemplative experiences. Okay? This presumes, of course, that a practitioner is technically skilled and facile. right? In order for the emergence of new experiences to arrive, there needs to be a certain ability to maintain your attention, have attentional balance. There needs to be the ability to sit still, right? To not be distracted or wiggly and so forth, right? The physical kind of attentive powers need to be honed. But these practices of spontaneous appreciation do not involve the subject-object complex. Okay? This is a key feature that the sense of being in a world that's objectified dissolves. Right? The intentionality, what we call in Western philosophy intentionality, the subject-object complex with duality, that framework collapses into what's called mere awareness of pure awareness. Okay? So already you see there are these tensions, right? Now, within those tensions, there's various styles. And what I've been doing is trying to articulate those. Okay? So what I'm going to share with you tonight in a rather rapid manner is just to give you a sense of the myriad ways that these practices can play out, the kind of strategies that these practices undergo. Okay? So contemplative style, what I mean by it, is a manner in which a practice is enacted. It's the how. Okay? It's not the what, it's the how. Okay? So there's a performativity, how a practice is performed, and the character of that performance. So there are what I'll call attentional practices, and these are very well established, particularly within the contemplative sciences, what gets called focused attention, and what gets called monitoring or open monitoring. And focused attention is very simple. It's where you're focusing your attention on a single object, whereas monitoring is you're monitoring the contents, you're observing the contents of consciousness, of feelings, of sensations, of thoughts as they arise. So those are two distinct different styles. They often go hand in hand. But I want to complexify this and add to it with multiple layers. There are social practices, right? There are practices for the cultivation of pro-social affect. Okay? These are also pretty well established in contemporary parlance, loving kindness practices, compassion practices. But then there are relational practices, practices that involve an intersubjective exchange, right? Of some kind of another, with a human being or a non-human being, that you're relating, you're in a social relationship of receptivity and agency. And then there are imaginative practices, of which there are various kinds. Predominantly, there are visualization practices, where you take a visual image and you focus on it and you hone in on it, but then you complexify it, right? And this is mental imagery or sort of visual imagery to alter the shape of an intention, including self-image, right? How do you consider or conceive yourself, your own identity, but also body scheme, body image, etc. And there are what I call simulation practices, practices that you actually imitate other ways of being in the world, right? Virtual reality is where I go, right? You're in a mimicking mode. And this imitation to the extent of inducing an automation, right? You mimic it to the extent that you are automatically doing it, right? It becomes kind of deeply ingrained. So there are other practices called remedial practices that you would apply an antidote, right? Like a doctor would give you a medicine, right? You would apply love to counter hate, for instance, certain affective or emotional states, right? These are quite popular. There are transmutational practices, where rather than applying an antidote to counteract, you're actually taking a state, right, and you're transforming. You're taking a state like an alchemical process, which is the primary metaphor here, and you're transforming it, which is different than applying an antidote as a doctor would give you medicine, right? So different analogies here, different processes. There are practices of integration, taking advantageous experiences that, such as bliss, non-conceptuality. These are very typical meditative experiences that arise that you then integrate into your ordinary life, that you integrate beyond your experience, but also in your contemplative sessions, but then also adversarial experiences. You integrate these, or in Tibetan we say long chair, that is to say, you take them onto the path, you bring them into your life And these can be experiences of sickness, of physical pain, of trauma, of death, and so on and so forth, right? So they're not always advantageous, they can be adversarial. There are analytical practices where you're using your intellect to deconstruct how things were put together. You're taking them apart in your mind. There are contextualization practices, which attention to context, the self-referential bodies and minds are situated. That is to say, there are practices that are used to contextualize the self within their local worlds, within their communities, within their environments, whether they be natural or social or otherwise. But then these processes, in so doing, are contextualizing. That is to say, they are taking the self and they're making it part of those contexts, right? So it works both ways. There are reflective practices where you take a certain kind of content and you reflect on its value. You reflect on its meaning. You try to make sense of it in a very kind of contemplative way, you might say. There are narrative practices of telling stories, but sometimes it's reading the stories of those you want to emulate in order to get ideas of the kind of activities you want to perform, the ways of being in the world that you want to do. But these are also autobiographical narratives, right? There are stories we tell ourselves about how we want to be in the world, right? They can be interior narratives about how we want to construct ourselves. Okay? And there are all sorts of body practices, right? Somatic practices or bodily oriented practices, postural, think yoga, kinesthetic, right? All kinds of deliberate movement practices. Okay, so meditation isn't always about just being still. It can be about movement, kinesis of the body, and positions. There are sensorial practices, deep immersion practices that are deep listening or deep sensorial practices, where you're immersing yourself in environments of the sense organs in order to attune to these sensorial processes and the correlative senses that emerge. There are ecstatic processes or practices for inducing bliss, right? We'll go over some of that this evening. There are visceral practices, practices that activate a visceral sense. And I talked about simulation before. This is the kind of next level from the simulation practice. Okay, self-emergent, I talked about a little bit, which are sort of setting the conditions for experiences to emerge. So it's not that you're doing anything except for creating the conditions for self-emergence. There are letting be practices. What is it to totally relax, right? In deep, spontaneous way, totally relax, right? To be at ease without responses to the world, without reflexes. There are non-dual practices, so-called breakthrough practices, cutting through discursiveness, tensions of the body, and so on and so forth. There are exhaustion practices, where you run as far as you can, you scream aloud as loud as you can, you make these intense, exhilarating gestures to the point of physical exhaustion and collapse. And in that, you notice deep relaxation. Okay, so that's all a way of kind of framework and sort of stirring the water, so we don't think meditation is one thing, right? So we don't think that there's something monolithic about these other practices. They're diverse in their styles, and they're applied across contexts. One thing to keep in mind here with all of these styles that I laid out, many of these styles are part of a single formal meditation session. So it's not like you would just go do one style. No. You would oscillate according to your own adeptness, according to your own level of skillfulness, and apply these different styles according to the experiences that emerge, according to the conditions. Okay, this is very important. These are styles, and now I want to look at some specific practices, the sort of case studies from the Tibetan tradition. Yikes. Wrong button. Okay, in order to do so, it's very important that we're going to talk about Vajrayāna practices. We understand that these are within a broader curriculum. Okay? So the first thing is there are preliminary practices, or what we call preparatory practices. And there are what we call ordinary preliminary practices and extraordinary preliminary practices. The ordinary are a contemplation of how remarkable it is to be a human being. Okay? That's the first thing that we start with. How rare and extraordinary and precious it is to be a human being. Okay, ideas that things change, that pain emerges, and discomfort emerges, that cause and effect of actions are inevitable. And then you go through these extraordinary preliminary practices, which are called refuge, taking refuge in the Buddha Dharma Sangha, generating an altruistic attitude, right? You set your motivation, intention is very important practices. There's what are called mandala offering to the cosmos, which are these contextualizing processes I made reference to, where you're contextualizing yourself within the broader framework of the cosmological context. There are Vajrasattva deity purification practices, imagining yourself bathing in pure white. Guru yoga, relational practices. Then there are generation stage practices, which I'll talk about briefly, and completion stage, which I'll focus on this evening. So this then are the generation stage practices, the deity yoga, in which you simulate yourself as the sublime body of the deity. And the idea here is that you're mimicking through visualization, through bodily gestures, through breathwork, an alternative way of being in the world called the deity, right, this sublime body. And this begins by reducing the objective world to a state of openness or emptiness. That is to say, it's deconstructed from any fixed point. And in so doing, then you generate an ordinary sense, your ordinary sense of self, rather, is generated as a sublime body. And this is called the mandalic world, these inventory worlds in which you enter. And these are designed to transfigure the ordinary habitual body scheme and self-image, right? Sense of identity and being in the world, your sense of environments, right? Now you're in a new environment, into these sublime environments, into a sublime, etc. And this concludes with the dissolution of the deity into the mandala, into open silence, and the reemergence of the self in the world. And this is repeated over and over and over again. After that, there are these completion stage practices, which are really somatic yoga. So by somatic, I mean bodily oriented, right? These are very much about the body. So much of, again, the sort of current discourse about meditation is it's about your brain, and it's a kind of neurocognitive functioning that's important. And these practices that I'm interested in are very much saying, well, okay, yes, attentional faculties are very important. Of course, cognition and perception are primary. However, these are body-centric practices. Okay? They're body-centric. So these apply physical yogic exercises, breath work, visualization to manipulate interior bodily energies, right? So you simulate, you mimic, and you harness thresholds of experiences at the edge of the self, right? So these moments in life that are threshold experiences, falling asleep at night, right? Hypnagogic states, dream states, right? Dying, mimicking, simulating the dying process, orgasm, sexual bliss, so on and so forth, in order to transmute these extreme or threshold experiences into acute wakefulness. Okay? And there are many traditions of this. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I just want to give you a sense that I'm not presenting one tradition. Okay? Tonight is I'm pulling from various traditions in order to show you diversity. But there's all kinds of traditions, these completion state practices in the Tibetan world, in the different orders or traditions of Tibetan Buddhism. And these are some of them. The ones that I study closely are the Kala Chakra system, the 6 yogas of the Tummo, and Dzogchen, or what's called the Great Perfection. So I'm going to start now. This is about darkness practices, okay? And these darkness practices we have in different traditions. We have in the Kala Chakra tradition, we have in Dzogchen traditions. All of these practices we have in different traditions. These are sensory deprivation practices, okay? These are practices of sky gazing, looking at a cloudless sky, looking off to the sun, or practices of immersion in darkness. exposure to sunlight, cloudless sky, okay, prolonged darkness. So there are different bodily postures, gazes, attentional modalities, breath work, visualizations that these practices involve in order to limit exogenously driven inputs, that is to say, inputs from the world into our experience, right? That there's a kind of objectivity, what are called priors, right? That there's a world out there that's informing our experience. These are designed to limit them through a kind of sensory deprivation. And by limiting these inputs to recalibrate spatiotemporal boundaries, right? Current neuroscience suggests that we predict our world, that the brain is a predictive machine, that you've heard that. This is sort of these theories of cognitive science are actually not that new, but they've really kind of taken off over the last few years, that the brain is a predictive machine, that there's a world out there that it senses and it makes sense of it with advanced contact, right? And with that kind of model, that we make sense of our world rather through space and time. This is sort of limiting the input. And in so doing, they say that you're freed from the necessity to predict change, right? And the boundaries of the self, the kind of cognitive stress, then is relaxed. Then what happens if we don't have to predict our world constantly? Is the question these traditions are raising, right? If you take away the stimuli of our everyday ordinary wakefulness, they say, well, visions emerge. And these are endogenously generated visions. Visions from, you might say, the mind itself, from the interiority, right? They're not exogenously or world generated, but they're generated from the inside. Okay, and they stimulate self-emergence of these dynamic visions. So here's some paintings, right? These are kind of pictures or pictorial depictions of these practices, looking off to the side of the sun, and these different kinds of visions that emerge. And this is a Tibetan text where we have drawings of these different visions. Okay, so there are these ideas of totems and so forth, that there are different configurations, visual patterns that emerge and that are generated from within the interior world when sensory input is deprived. Okay, these are modern depictions by a couple, actually, that did these practices, who are artists and drew them during their retreat periods. So here we have some sort of contemporary depictions of visions of those who have done these practices. So next, I want to segue into dream, and there are dream practices. All right, these practices of dream have the intent, they're called dream yoga practices. Their intent is to recognize your dream world, right? And to recognize your dream world, your dream time as unreal. And in so doing, to induce lucid dreaming, to familiarize yourself with what we'll call lucidity, right? A sense of ongoing fluidity of awareness. And that there's purposes of doing this is to alter normative reality, because we can do things in our dream that we can't ordinarily do. Has anyone flown in their dreams recently? Right? Yeah? Has anyone walked through walls in their dreams? Gone, right? See, I thought it's like, it's not unusual. Okay, so this is inducing these states, but in a very lucid manner. Okay? So to train in the liminality of dreaming and waking, to become familiar with the seamless continuity of dreamlike experiences while awake. This 12th century Tibetan figure in Maldur, he says there are 6 different procedures for this practice of dream yoga. There are other formulas of 4 or 8 and so forth, but this is kind of classical, that you recognize your dreams, where when you're in the dreaming state, you recognize you're dreaming. That you train or refine your abilities to dream, which is fascinating. This is saying that dreaming is a skill. Okay? Dreaming is something you can learn. Right? You can go to kind of school, if I may, and learn about dreaming. These are skills that can be learned. They're not just what happens to you when you're unconscious. Very different perspective. right? And that in so doing, by learning and training, that you can increase your dream experience, right? And that you can transform things in your dreams. We'll go through that a little bit. Transform men into women, and vice versa. Transform monkeys into dogs, into lizards, etc., etc. But you can transform your being normal. And that in so doing, you ascertain objective appearances, that there are segues into your waking life that are meaningful. That is to say, the objective world, once you wake up, then starts to transform, that there are efficacies to this work. I don't know if you can see this very well, but this is hypnagogic and kinesthetic imagery. Okay, so I'm going to focus on hypnagogic means between waking and sleeping states. Okay, this is called hypnagogia. And kinesthetic means movement. Okay. So I'm drawing now from, again, these are all texts that I've translated and that I studied. This is a 17th century figure named Taranatha, in one of his meditation manuals in dream yoga. He writes, okay, this is what you do. This is his instruction, okay? In the place below you, imagine that you are on an extremely steep precipice, like being on the edge of a cliff. Okay? So imagine you're on the edge of a cliff, the Grand Canyon or something like that. Okay? Imagine that you are sitting on the lip of this precipice in the sky, 1 arrow's length high. So not only are you on the lip of the precipice, but you're 1 arrow's length high. What is that? 1.5 feet, right? Hovering above it. Okay? You're not even on the ground on the precipice. Then suddenly, you look down. At that instant, you say to yourself, I have fallen asleep. So this is the metaphor of literally falling asleep, right? You're literally falling into the depths of sleep. Okay, this is what's called, in dream science, the sleep start. That there's a kinesthetic imagery that triggers the body. I don't know, have people ever had that? When you go into a dream, you'll have a moment where your body shakes uncontrollably. It's called a sleep start. And this is meant to trigger that. Okay? These appearances are the appearances of a dream. Since these are appearances of a dream, think to yourself, right? The dreamer should think to themselves, why are you afraid? Why am I afraid? It's just a dream. Even though you're falling through space, right? Let yourself fall down with a thumb. Not falling, right? Or not falling. Almost hit the ground. So if you hear the thumb, but you don't hit the ground, right? No one's hurt. Imagine that you vanish into things, right? You become the material world of your dream space. You become the ground, the cliff, the surrounding. Or alternatively, come higher and higher, right? Above, like flying with a bird. Like before, right? If you do that, alternatively, you don't just stay there and come out and you fly to the top. And then you sit at the top of this precipice where you were before and pay attention, right? So bringing kind of vivid alertness to your dream. In similar ways, train again and again. Do this every time, over and over. Okay? So these sleep starts are meant to induce the lucidity within the dream, to wake you up in dream time. Okay? And when you're awake, that is to say, you're lucid in dream time, they say there's a dreaming body. Different than your ordinary habitual physical waking body. It's you in the dream world. And that's called your dream body. Okay? Belong to you. Belong to you. Okay, he says, stay with your interest. Train in being unimpeded to move upwards, move downwards, move diagonally. That is to say, if you usually sit, which I usually do most days, then get up and run. If you usually walk, then sit. If you usually walk straight, zigzag. Right? Okay? Do things in different ways in your dream than you would in your waking world with your ordinary body, your waking body. Move downwards, diagonally, move to the side, across pillars, across walls, across the ceiling, right? Remember, you're in the dream. You can do all kinds of things. That's what he's suggesting. Otherwise, enter a tiny smoke hole, right? In Tibet, they had, furnaces. The pipes would go out the ceiling, and you'd be able to draw little holes, right, where the smoke goes out. So imagine yourself just shooting up through the little hole in the ceiling, right? The smoke holes and so forth. Go through precipices, water, fire, subdue wild carnivorous animals, right? Wrestle with tigers and so forth. Because you can do these things in the dream world, go for it. Now you're exercising your imagination. Fly in the sky, slide on the ground, right? Slip or slide all around. Walk on top of water and so on. In sum, this is how you train in the methods of being mindful. And being mindful here means paying attention in the lucidity of the dream space. Okay? These practices are then brought into the waking world so that they're not just dream practices, but then you take them into your waking life, what are called conjuring apparition practices. During the day, this is the 14th century author named Longchenpa, the Dzogchen author, he says, during the day, in his instructions on dream yoga, be very diligent, right? Be very diligent in conjuring apparitions. Conjuring apparitions. And being an illusion maker. That is to say, invite play into your life. Invite imaginal worlds. And that will loosen you up. It will loosen you up. Right? You are exercising one's imagination. So the third and final practice I'll go through tonight is sort of paradigmatic, effortful practice in Vajrayāna. And it's, as I mentioned before, these practices are very bodily oriented. Okay, here we have young Gompa, who's a 13th century contemplative and scholar who wrote this. If you don't understand the actual abiding nature of the body, if you don't really get the body and pay attention to the body, you don't understand the vital points of the meaning of meditation. Again, centrality of the bodily experience, of sensorial experience, of sense of bodily image of the self in the world as embodied. Okay? There are these practices that I'll go through here called tummo. These are, as I mentioned, sort of paradigmatic Vajrayāna practices that are effortful. And they're meant to induce ecstasy by volitionally mobilizing bodily heat. The philosophy here is that the body has inherent heat and warmth, right? And that you can mobilize that internal warmth in order to induce ecstatic states. It's usually translated as inner heat or psychic heat, but more literally, the word tum means fierce, and mo means lady, and it's a reference to a goddess named Chandali. Descriptive yogic language of heat for visualizing fireballs. There's a fantastic language about how you think about these practices, right? Extraordinary detail. That you wear the clothes of inner heat, that you eat the foods of yogic heat, that you are stoking the inner embers and the blissful warmth, etc. Okay, so these are practices that have a vocabulary, right? They have a syntax, they have context. These are practices, as I alluded to in the beginning, that are like it. Now, the outcome is actually not to induce heat, right? I mean, that is a byproduct or a symptom, but the outcome, the intent is coalescence of bliss with emptiness, which is a kind of non-dual ecstatic state. Oh. Could you plug this in? Okay, and these practices came from the modern popular imagination with this woman, Alexander David Neal. Has anyone read her autobiography? Okay, cannot recommend enough, right? One of the sort of frontier, sort of trailblazers of Tibetan studies, but also, and of course, her accounts are fantastical, but nonetheless, she's bringing to contemporary parlance through her stories knowledge about these traditions in Tibet, in which she visited and really was the first foreign woman to go into Tibet. She's a Belgian-French explorer and author. She lived in Tibet on and off in the 1920s. Okay, she described in one of her books, Magic and Mystery in Tibet, that there were these practices in which the monks would go and they would take sheets and they would dip them in ice cold water in the lakes in Tibet, so 12,000 plus feet. And in the middle of the winter, and they would get naked and wrap themselves in these wet clothes, right, or these wet sheets. And then they would have in her language, a competition. She calls them psychic sports, I think is their language, right? That they would then heat these blankets, okay? And this is a fictional tale, it seemed, but actually these practices happen inside Tibet, and ethnography has recently revealed that these practices have historically happened in Tibet. And there's a sheet drying ceremony that happened at this monastery in Eastern Tibet most recently within the last few years. So there are these practices and ceremonies that continue. But these practices assume that there's an interior body that is what they call subtle. And by subtle here, I mean visceral. Visceral meaning that you can sense it if you pay attention to it. You can, if you pay attention to the inside of your body, it's called interoceptive perception, as opposed to awareness of the outside. These traditions claim, and there's a model for it. There are chakras or wheels, and there are what are called channels that are pathways throughout the body that run vertically from the brainstem to the perineum. That there are winds or currents of vital energies that flow throughout the body, and there are what I'll call nuclei, tigre, these refined essences, seminal essences that flow throughout the body, similar to liquid drops. Okay, here are modern day practitioners of this, exemplars of the Tibetan tradition, and they're taking this posture, this pose of these practices. So these are physical yoga practices that involve postures, they involve breathwork, they involve visualization. That is to say, they're multimodal, as I was discussing. So here's an excerpt from Tongton Gyalpo, who is a 15th century Tibetan author who was writing about these practices. He said, after slowly clearing out the stale air, right, blow out your air so you're fresh, slowly inhale equally into both nostrils while drawing the winds in and down. Slowly draw up the lower wind, and you join the upper and lower winds at the navel. So there's a conjoinment of these winds at the navel, upper and lower. By that, the lower winds move, causing a fire to blaze up. So you're actually igniting warmth in the belly through these winds, causing a fire to blaze up below the navel in a shape like a porcupine's quill. Right? Porcupine's quill. Flames like a porcupine's quill. Breathing again makes it blaze up the navel. You're now raising this fire that you've ignited up the navel. At the third retention of the breath, it arrives at the heart, and its heat causes drops from the syllable hum letter in the head to fall like a string of pearls, right? Now this is downward, so dissension. Imagine the drops striking the fire at the heart. This is extraordinarily descriptive, right? These are again kinesthetic imagery. The fire does not go out, nor does it flicker. These are profound points, are very important. Okay, this is exactly what you need to pay attention to. Through this process, first warmth will arise, then bliss, then the meditative absorption of bliss. That is to say, bliss, but not in a fixed manner, in emptiness, bliss, emptiness, and then open your eyes. That suffuses your body. So this is this process it's called thermogenesis. Okay, This is yogic heat induced through the sequence of breath retention, forceful breathing, physical exercises. Sometimes you're slapping yourself. You're sort of trying to evoke arousal, right? Moving and striking and visualization practices, kinesthetic imagery, as I mentioned. These induce thermogenesis, the process of generating body heat without shivering, right? If you're cold, you don't have a jacket or whatever, and for an extended or prolonged period, your body starts to shake, right? It starts to shiver, and that's its mechanism to produce heat. These practices produce the same heat, and as I'll show you, greater levels of heat without shivering. Okay, so bodily heat again is a symptom, not the purpose. Okay? In Tibetan manuals, tantric practice is very much associated with sexual practice, sexual yoga practices. And tummo is historically practiced with sexual yoga in some tantric contexts. But there's divergent views about whether it was an actual consort, as to say, a physical person, or that they're imaginary. There's kind of historical situatedness to that. But tummo mimics intense blissful excitation from sexual orgasm, but redirects the experiential flow of orgasmic bliss to stimulate a state of bliss-infused consciousness. This is very, very interesting, right? Because physiologically, sexual intercourse redirects blood flow from the genitals to increase blood flow in the brain. And a similar hemodynamic paradigm is in operation in these tummo practices. We might say a kind of reverse process. Okay, this was practiced, this was rather studied in 1981, first by this cardiologist, Herbert Benson, who demonstrated that these practices show that intentional regulation of body heat. Okay, and this is the first time that there's empirical research on the ability to regulate body heat and also activation of the sympathetic nervous system. And then in 2013, there was further studies that showed the ability to raise core body temperature, and that thermogenesis raised body temperature into the fever zone, that is to say over 100 degrees, okay? And what's interesting to me about these studies is not so much the sort of human feat, right? This is about sort of superhuman. But it's what are the mechanisms at play that are distinct features. And for me, the most interesting finding is that visualization is critical to override the threshold of the fever zone. That is to say, those who practice visualization and those who didn't had dramatic differences, right? So this shows the influence of this kinesthetic imagery and underlying cognitive mechanisms. So you see the sort of themes starting to emerge here, right? So with that, I'll offer some conclusion, some reflection to the battle of action. Sort of drill down to some of the nitty-gritty underlying mechanics and mechanisms and dynamics of these practices. Now I'd like to zoom out. Okay? So this is about making sense. Why would we be interested in these practices? Again, I would suggest it's not because superhuman feats. It's not about some kind of paranormal psychology that I'm personally interested in. But there are other skills here involved. Okay? We're living in an epoch with heightened distraction, rapid change, which requires new ways of thinking and responding. It requires what I'll call new ethics. And I don't just mean by ethics a moral stance, although I think that that's intrinsic to what I'm suggesting, but ethics as far as a way of being, new ways of being. And if we look at the survival of humanity, we see that it hinges on how we shed maladaptive systems while retooling new systems of technology. And I offered earlier some of this research, in a very synoptic manner, from archaeology and actually cultural anthropology that shows how humans have adapted and evolved particularly in our species, Homo sapiens, by modular tools. And I think that that's very much that's analogous to why I'm suggesting practices, why I want to think about these multiple styles, why I want to think about similarities between these practices, kinesthetic imagery, such as breathwork and so on and so forth. Right? To think about these as technologies that we can retool. And there's a crisis of scientific culture that I sort of evoke Husserl here, but what I mean here is a kind of objectivism, right? The sense of the world out there that we live in, rather than we inhabit a world that's co-emergent. This kind of crisis of scientific culture reduces lived experience, while the primacy of subjectivity, right, while our own interior lives is the ground of knowing. It's important to keep in mind, particularly as we learn, as we grow throughout life, particularly at these moments when we're in college and in educational settings that are intentional about learning, that our own subjectivity is prime, right? That our own ways of knowing are very important. How we know the world, and that we know the world is primary. And that these, our capacities to innovate and adapt depend on our ability to draw from our immense heritage of human knowledge, from our intercultural toolbox of know-how, I might say, right? That is to say, let's look across cultures, let's look across paradigms, let's look across traditions, and try to make sense of them. Try to make sense of them, I would argue, for adaptation and survival, but more so for what we'll call flourishing, right? For really moving beyond baseline into states of flourishing. Like contemplative technologies provide a kind of know-how, a very specific kind of know-how to learn about the human condition, about our minds, about our bodies, about how we respond to the world. And therefore, we need to take these technologies and practices seriously. And then Vajrayāna practices induce states of wakefulness, kind of vivid alertness, of arousal, right? Meditation is not all about relaxation. It's also about states of arousal, as I've shown with these practices. And that kind of arousal induces heightened, acute attentiveness, but also of being at ease. Not relaxation in the stupefied sense, but deep kind of being at ease with what happens in responsiveness to other living beings, to our own interior lives, our emotions, that can lead to dramatic enhancements, right? Of somatic, affective, and cognitive performance, right? That we can change how we are in life, which isn't always obvious. But these practice traditions suggest it's possible. Thank you so much. I know that was a lot, but I really appreciate it.